The final sight of Miriam Candle. The autumn of 1861 in Caro Hollow was the kind of season that seemed to draw its breath before the first frost, the kind that wrapped the valley in a quiet so deep it seemed to seep into the bones. That night, the harvest moon rose like a pale, watchful eye over the narrow gorge, silvering the mist that clung to the trees. Miriam Candle was seen walking toward the old footbridge, the one whose ropes creaked like a sigh, with each step a lantern cupped between her palms as if the flame were a living thing that needed shelter. The sight was strange enough. Few women crossed the bridge at night, but stranger still was the sight of her two young daughters, swaddled in quilts, stitched from the fabric of what locals recognized as Miriam's own wedding dress. There had never been a marriage record in the parish ledger, no witnesses to vows, no mention of a groom. The quilts hung heavy over the small shoulders of Mercy and Temperance Candle, their edges brushing the damp boards as the family made its slow way across. The bridge swayed under the weight, its lantern-lit shadows stretching long over the black water below. The flame bowed low as though in greeting to the current, flickering with each breath of wind that curled up from the river. Before dawn, the quilts were found folded neatly on the far bank, still holding the warmth of bodies that had lain within them. Between the bundles sat Miriam's lantern, the wick blackened, the glass still warm to the touch. There was no sign of Miriam herself, not on the bridge, not along the river banks, not in the woods beyond. The sisters were discovered hours later stepping out from the tree line. Their faces were streaked with soot, their hands stained the pale yellow of melted tallow. When asked where they had been, the sisters said nothing. Instead, they lifted their open palms as if showing a wound too raw to name their eyes, not pleading for understanding but warning against questions. The strange return of Mercy and Temperance. By the time the sun had burned away the last threads of morning fog, the news had moved through Caro Hollow like a draught under a door. Mercy and Temperance, no older than 8, were back among the living, but something in them seemed set apart. They did not cling to the hands that reached for them. They did not cry, though their hair smelled faintly of smoke and something older, beeswax left too long near a flame. The parish women whispered that soot marked more than their cheeks. It lined their very breath. The stains on their hands were not the grime of the forest, but the residue of melted candles, and in the way they held those hands. Fingers slightly curved, palms cupped. There was a suggestion they still cradled a light no one else could see. No one claimed to have heard them speak in those first hours. Even when the miller's wife offered broth and bread, they only glanced at each other as if weighing the exchange in some silent ledger of their own. Their silence was not the stunned muteness of grief, but something deliberate, like the stillness before an answer is spoken in a language the listener cannot understand. Those who tried to meet their eyes found themselves looking away, first unsettled by the depth there, the suggestion of reflection, as if a flame burned somewhere far behind the pupils. It was decided, though no one could recall who first suggested it, that the Reverend Fitch should take them in. His rectory sat apart from the village close enough for the congregation to believe they were being cared for, far enough that the hollow could rest easier. The sisters walked there without protest, their small steps in perfect rhythm, never breaking the distance between them. Taken in by Reverend Fitch. Reverend Josiah. Fitch was not an old man, though the solitude of his post had already etched lines at the corners of his eyes. His rectory stood in the lee of a narrow hill hemmed by blackthorn and bramble, a place where the wind carried the scent of damp stone year-round. The sisters settled into its spare rooms without curiosity moving, as if they already knew the spaces. Fitch in his ledger later noted their voices, when they did speak, were so alike it seemed they came from a single mouth, each syllable shaped in perfect unison. More than once he woke in the night to the faint hush of their bare feet crossing the corridor outside his room. Following the sound, he found the latch to the chapel hall ajar. Inside the air would be still except for the faint sway of two taper flames set in iron sconces, their light bent toward the altar, as if drawn by a breath no living lungs had given. By morning he often discovered the girls kneeling in the orchard skirts soaked with dew, their palms pressed flat to the frozen ground, as if feeling for something deep below the frost. The congregation whispered that these were not the gestures of orphans, but of vessels, chosen perhaps unwillingly to hold something older than themselves. Some claimed that Miriam had been seen again long after her disappearance, drifting between the orchard trees in a gown of smoke, her face an empty flicker where the eyes should be. Others swore that on certain nights the rectory windows glowed red as coals, and if one dared to look inside, they might see the sisters seated side by side, each holding a candle whose wick never diminished, their expressions turned inward toward prayers no god of the parish would claim. Whispers in the congregation. Winter in Caro Hollow has a way of deepening every rumor, pressing it into the marrow of those who linger too long in the cold. By the first frost after the sisters came to live at the rectory, the congregation had begun to weave their silences into stories. It was not enough to say the girls were quiet or that they kept their heads bowed in the pew. No, they were vessels people whispered hollowed out to carry something that did not belong to this world. A tanner's wife claimed she had seen Miriam Candle herself months after her vanishing, drifting through the orchard in a gown of smoke that trailed against the frost. Where eyes should have been there was only a flickering hollow, as though the light of a dying ember had taken her place. Others told of nights when the rectory windows glowed red as bedded coals, an unnatural pulse against the dark. Those brave enough to peer inside spoke of seeing the sisters side by side, hands steady around candles that burned without consuming their wicks. What prayers they whispered no one could say, but those who dared watch too long reported a strange taste in their mouths afterward, a bitterness like wool singed by a careless flame and the faint, aching sorrow of something remembered too late. The stories multiplied in the hush of hymn breaks and over bread tables, passed with the care of something fragile yet poisonous. Some feared the sisters, others pitied them, but none could look away when they walked together through the frost-bound lanes, the hem of their skirts whispering across the stones. Their faces lifted toward a sky that seemed to hold an answer only they could read. The ash in the chapel. In January, with snow bowing the roofs and the river sealed under a skin of ice, Reverend Fitch rose before dawn to stoke the chapel stove. He carried with him a bundle of kindling, expecting the cold emptiness of an unlit nave. Instead, he stopped short at the threshold. The air was thick with a scent that turned his stomach beeswax gone rancid, a sweetness soured by time. On every pew lay small drifts of pale ash, as though some unseen hand had dusted the wood with the remnants of something once living. It was not the fine ash of a hearth, but coarser, clinging to his fingertips when he reached out. The pattern was deliberate, each pile arranged at the end of a seat, as if marking where a body might have rested. At the altar rail, 2 candle stubs stood upright, melted almost to their bases. Though the wicks were blackened, a thin curl of smoke still rose from each winding lazily toward the rafters. Fitch felt an unexpected lurch in his chest, not fear exactly, but something uncomfortably close to pity. He searched the corners, the vestry, the narrow stair to the belfry, but there was no sign of the sisters, and yet the sight of those gutted candles, their smoke trailing upward as if reluctant to leave, lodged in his mind with a weight he could not shake. It was as though he had walked in on a vigil that was not meant for his eyes, a service for a congregation long since departed, carried out by hands unseen but not unfeeling. Clara Voss and the corridor candle. Later that same week, Clara Voss, a seamstress known for her steady work and unwillingness to indulge in gossip, arrived at the rectory with a bundle of mended garments. She found the front door ajar, the winter air pooling in the entryway. Assuming the Reverend was near, she stepped inside without knocking. The first thing she noticed was the hush, a silence so complete it seemed to drink the sound of her own breath. She called out once-twice each syllable dissolving into the stillness. Turning toward the corridor, she froze. There stood the Candle Sisters, motionless, their hands clasped around the same taper. Wax streamed over their knuckles in slow, milky rivulets, dripping onto the floorboards where it pooled like congealed milk. Their faces were turned toward her, but their eyes remained fixed on the flame as if it alone possessed the right to judge her intrusion. Clara's throat tightened, though she could not have said whether from fear or the weight of something unspoken pressing into the room. She backed away without turning, the cold air of the yard striking her like a release. She would not return to the rectory. Later in the market, when asked why she had left her work unfinished, Clara only shook her head. The truth was that the sight of those 2 small figures joined by a single candle had lodged in her mind. With a permanence she could not unpick, the memory of heat spilling over pale skin, haunting her long after her hands had returned to their stitching. The orchard frost and the humming roots. February brought a thaw to the rest of the valley, the river's skin cracking to let through the slow push of water, the snow in the fields pulling back into thirsty soil. But the orchard behind Reverend Fitch's rectory defied the season. Frost still crusted the grass, clinging stubbornly to each blade and branch, silvering the black bark until the trees seemed carved from pewter. No sun, no rain, no warm wind could lift it. Children, restless from weeks indoors, dared each other to creep to the fence. It was then they began to whisper of a sound beneath the soil, a thin, wavering hum that seemed to rise from the roots themselves. The tune, if it could be called that, was neither joyous nor mournful, but something in between, as though the earth were holding a long, unbroken breath. One boy swore he saw movement between the rows, 2 figures in matching gray dresses, each holding a candle, high their flame steady in the windless air. They moved as if guiding something invisible that followed just out of sight, something that needed their light to navigate the frozen ground. The sight unnerved even the boldest of the children. One by one they ran home, their fear carrying them faster than the frost-bound air allowed. That evening the village reached a quiet agreement. None would go near the orchard again, not until the frost lifted, and perhaps not even then. Caro Hollow had long learned that certain places once claimed by the strange did not easily return to the keeping of ordinary folk. The failed conversation. On the final Sunday before Lent, Reverend Fitch decided the weight of silence had gone on too long. After service, he asked the sisters to remain in the chapel, their small faces unreadable as they stood together in the aisle. He spoke gently, inviting them to sit with him near the altar rail, telling them he wished to understand what burden they carried. His voice, so often steady in sermon, faltered as he admitted his desire to help her, to offer whatever comfort a man of God might provide. The sisters inclined their heads in perfect unison, their expressions calm but distant. Then they began to speak. The words came softly in a language he did not recognize, neither Latin nor any of the old hymns, but something older still, the syllables flaring and dimming like embers in a hearth. Their voices intertwined so seamlessly that it seemed one mouth had found a way to speak in two tones at once. Fitch's hands trembled on his knees, not from fear, but from the strange gravity of the sound, as though the chapel itself leaned in to listen. When the last word faded, the sisters lifted their shared candle and pinched out the flame between their fingertips. Darkness fell with startling suddenness, blotting out even the faint light through the stained glass. In that blackness, Fitch's breath caught. He had the uncanny sense of being blind, not just in his eyes, but in his understanding, as though something essential had been taken from him. When the light returned a moment later, they were gone, leaving the air thick with the scent of extinguished wax and a silence that felt almost triumphant. Departing the rectory's shelter, with the thaw came rumors that the Candle sisters no longer required the Reverend's roof. A peddler from Dovetail, accustomed to traveling the valley's back roads, claimed he had seen them not on the lanes or near the church, but stepping directly out of the hollow itself. He swore they emerged from the ground skirts damp as though they had walked up through wet earth rather than across it. Their hair was threaded with pale roots, brittle and fine as spun glass. The sight unsettled him, but it was their expressions that followed him long after he had left Caro Hollow. They looked, he told the blacksmith over a drink, as though they'd just been told a secret. One so terrible and so dear it was burning them alive from the inside out. He refused to speak their names again. His usual route avoided the hollow entirely, even if it meant days of detour. Some in the village took his story as proof that the sisters had severed their tie to the rectory, that whatever bond kept them in Reverend Fitch's care had loosened. Others argued the opposite, that they had sunk deeper into the lands, keeping no longer tethered to the church, but to something older, colder, and far more enduring. Either way, the hollow had grown quieter in their absence, the kind of quiet that leaves a man uncertain whether to feel relief or dread. The letters without a name. By March, the parish began receiving letters with no return address, their envelopes absent of wax seals, but smeared instead with tallow greasy, faintly scented of old candle smoke. The parchment inside was coarse, folded only once, each sheet bearing a single cramped line in an angular hand. "We are becoming what she asked of us." No salutation, no date, no signature. Reverend Fitch read the words aloud to the vestry during their meeting in the chapel, his voice echoing faintly beneath the rafters. No one dared to guess aloud who she might be, though the name Miriam Candle hovered unspoken on every tongue. The absence of explanation seemed more dangerous than any confession. When Fitch, unsettled, decided to burn the letters in the chapel stove, the parchment would not take the flame. Instead, the edges blackened and curled inward like damp leaves, but the center remained whole, the ink glistening as if freshly applied. He stoked the coals hotter, but the effect was the same. It was as if the words themselves refused to be destroyed, as though the act of writing them had fixed them into something beyond the reach of fire. In the weeks that followed, more letters came, each identical in form and tone, until a small stack of them sat on Fitch's desk. He kept them there under a scrap of cloth, unwilling to touch them unless necessary, yet unable to throw them away. The longer they stayed in the rectory, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the tallow scent was seeping into the wood of the walls, into the grain of the floorboards, into the marrow of the house itself. A season of fires that Lent was marked by a season of sudden, inexplicable fires. In the still hours before dawn, the stable behind the cooper's shop went up in a rush of heat and light, taking 2 mares and the harness-maker's boy, who had been sleeping in the loft. The villagers found only a blackened frame and the scent of burned leather. Days later, a shed behind the schoolhouse smoldered to nothing, leaving behind a perfect scorched circle. On the ground, the earth within it hardened and smooth as glass. No lantern had been left there, no careless chimney ash carried by the wind. Yet the whispers began immediately. Several claimed the Candle Sisters had been seen on the outskirts of each fire, their faces calm and pale, in the glow candles in hand, as though they were not witnesses, but officiants to some quiet ritual. Others dismissed it as misfortune, the work of sparks carried too far, or tools left where they shouldn't be. But one night, the rector's wife woke weeping from a dream she could not shake. In it, she had seen 2 candles walking across the fields, walking as if they were alive, their flames bending in the same slow rhythm, moving toward a horizon she could not see. Their light was neither warning nor comfort, but something inexorable, the pace of a funeral procession for which no mourner had yet been summoned. She told no one else, but the dream lingered in her mind, the light still moving steadily in the darkness behind her eyes. Ellis Wright and the third figure won. Evening, a farmer named Ellis Wright found himself wandering past the orchard fence, despite having promised his wife never to go near the place again. He carried a tin lantern and a small jar of oil, telling himself he only wanted to see if the pear trees had begun to bud. But when he reached the farthest row, he stopped. Beneath the gnarled limbs of the oldest tree stood the Candle Sisters, their hands clasped around a taper so slender it seemed a mere suggestion of a candle. The flame guttered, then rose, and in its light Ellis thought he saw a third figure kneeling at their feet. Her head was bowed as if in prayer, the outline of her form indistinct yet undeniably human. He did not wait for certainty. Fear propelled him back toward the road before his mind could frame what his eyes insisted was there. The next morning, Ellis tried to speak of it to the Reverend, but found the words choking in his throat as if some unseen hand pressed them back down. Instead, he began leaving scraps of writing on the chapel steps, hastily scrawled testimony describing the scene. In one note, he wrote of how the sisters' flame bent toward the kneeling figure, casting a halo that seemed to pulse like a living heartbeat. In another, he mentioned hearing a voice beneath the orchard's strange hum, a woman's voice repeating a name he could not bring himself to write. When the Reverend gathered the scraps, he found the ink smeared and the paper damp with oil, the words swimming as though unwilling to be preserved. A morning of melted tallow. April's sun brought a true thaw to the valley, but Caro Hollow's orchard remained stubbornly cold. A faint frost curled the grass into brittle spirals, snapping underfoot like thin glass. It was on one such morning that the sexton arrived early to tend to the chapel, expecting to sweep the aisles before the day's service. Instead, he found the nave glistening as though the walls themselves had wept during the night. Melted tallow coated the pews and pooled along the flagstones, still warm in places, carrying with it a heavy sweetness that clung to his tongue. At the center of it all, before the altar rail, a single candle stood nearly burned to the base. Its flame rose, steady, defiant, against the draughts that crept in through the warped boards. No one in the village dared to claim they had lit it. The reverend, upon hearing of the sight, ordered the congregation to remain seated that Sunday, with no sermon delivered. They sat in uneasy silence, eyes fixed on the candle as if it might reveal some message. When the bells tolled the hour, the flame flickered, once bent low, and extinguished itself without smoke, leaving only the faint, acrid scent of singed linen. Some swore they felt the hush tighten in that moment, a subtle pressure against the chest, as though the chapel itself had drawn in a breath and decided not to release it. The woman from Winslow. That August, a woman from the neighboring township of Winslow arrived in Caro Hollow with her infant son in her arms. She told those she passed that she had been led there by a dream of two girls who carried light cupped in their hands, a light so pure it seared the darkness from her heart. She found the chapel without asking for directions, as though an unseen path had been laid at her feet. The doors opened for her without a sound. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of melted wax and something softer, almost floral, though no flowers grew nearby. She placed her son on the front pew and whispered her petition into the empty nave, her words fragile as moth wings. When she turned to lift him again, she found him fast asleep, his small fist curled around the stub of a candle. She had not given it to him, and there was no mark on the wood to suggest it had been there before. Startled, but not afraid, she cradled the child and left the chapel feeling a warmth in her chest that stayed long after she stepped into the cool air outside. In the weeks that followed, more pilgrims came, some at dusk, others at dawn, each drawn by a similar pull they could not explain. They brought offerings, strips of cloth, locks of hair, jars of honey, laying them on the chapel floor in humble tribute. Each swore that as they stepped back into daylight, a comfort spread through them, unearned, yet undeniable, as though a burden had been quietly lifted without their asking. Those who challenged the legend. Not everyone who came to the chapel came in reverence. One evening, a pair of men arrived from a nearby town armed with lanterns and iron rods. They declared loudly to the small gathering outside that they would prove the Candle Sisters were nothing more than a tale told to frighten children. Their boots thudded on the chapel's threshold, their voices echoing in the nave before fading into silence. The door remained open behind them, lantern light casting long, uneasy shadows across the yard. An hour passed, then another. The villagers who had lingered expecting the men's return began to drift away, muttering about wasted time. At sunrise, the sexton found the chapel door swinging gently in the breeze. The men were gone. No footprints led away from the building, no dropped tools or torn cloth to mark a struggle. Only the faint, lingering warmth of extinguished candles and the subtle taste of smoke in the air hinted that anything had happened at all. No search was organized. No one wished to be the one to cross that threshold in the wake of their disappearance. The men's names faded quickly from local talk as if speaking them aloud might invite the same fate. In Caro Hollow, such vanishings were not pursued. They were folded neatly into the hush, where no one dared pry them loose again. Figures beneath the water. September brought relentless rain to Caro Hollow, the kind that swelled the orchard's earth into black pools and sent pale blossoms drifting like drowned moths across the standing water. The frost, however, clung stubbornly to each tree, silvering the bark even as the ground below became a mirror for the low sky. Children, despite repeated warnings, crept to the fence to watch the strange tableau. They whispered about seeing movement under the surface of the flooded rose, two girls in matching gray dresses, hair waving in the current hands, joined around a candle that burned with an unearthly blue flame. The light wavered in the ripples, bending and straightening, never sputtering. No one could explain how a flame could survive submerged, nor did anyone wish to test its reality by crossing the fence. A traveling fisherman, stopping in the village for shelter, overheard the children's tale and grew pale. That evening he refused to walk the road that cut through the hollow, choosing instead a long detour through the hills. Later, over ale, he admitted that each time he closed his eyes, he saw the candle's reflection floating on dark water. And if I looked too long, he said, his voice dropping, I feared I'd see my own face down there waiting. The orchard's fence became less a barrier and more a line between the living and something neither entirely dead nor willing to leave. The consecration that failed. By the Feast of All Souls, the vestry gathered in earnest to act against whatever had taken root in the chapel. They resolved to consecrate the place anew, believing a blessing might sever the Candle Sisters' tether to it. The curate led the procession, swinging a brass censer that released thick coils of frankincense. But as the heavy doors creaked open, the congregation halted. The nave was already filled with light. Hundreds of candles stood on every pew, their flames steady, no flicker of draught disturbing them. The air was thick with beeswax and something fainter, metallic, like the scent of warmed coins. No shadow moved among the flames, yet the onlookers felt watched as if the light itself had eyes. The curate stepped forward, but his knees locked before he could reach the altar rail. A silence had settled there, not the benign quiet of a holy space, but a profound stillness that pressed on the chest, slowing the breath. No word of the blessing was spoken. One by one the congregation turned away, retreating through the open doors into the cold air, leaving the candles to burn in their unbroken vigil. No attempt was made to bar the chapel again. It was understood without being said that whatever dwelled there had claimed its ground and would not be dislodged by prayer or holy water. A winter that watched back. Winter returned to Caro Hollow with no warning, sweeping down in a single night, as if the season had been waiting for a sign. Snow smothered the orchard under a seamless white bowing the chapel roof, and sealing hedgerows in drifts so deep they looked like the ridges of some sleeping beast. The rest of the village lay muffled in the hush fires, burning low shutters latched tight. Yet in that deep cold, the hollow seemed more alive than ever. A soft glow was sometimes seen moving from pew to pew within the chapel, visible through the warped glass, as if two figures tended each candle in turn. Those who lingered at the orchard's edge swore the frost on the chapel's eaves never formed near its threshold. Two narrow trails of bare earth wound from the snow into the doorway, the paths perfectly warm as though footsteps had been made moments before. No figure ever stood there, but the absence felt intentional, an invitation unspoken. A dairyman delivering cream one evening saw the chapel door drift open just enough for light to spill onto the snow. The glow gilded the white surface in a path that reached toward him, and the scent of honey-warm wax filled the air. He stayed rooted behind the stone wall, unwilling to test the depth of the hush that seemed to beckon. Later, he told his wife only that some doors once crossed would not open again in the same direction. The dairyman's vision. The dairyman who had glimpsed the chapel door ajar did not speak of it for weeks. When he finally gave voice to what he'd seen, it was in halting phrases over a pint at the tavern, his eyes fixed on the bubbles in his glass. He described standing behind the dry stone wall, the snow high against his boots, watching that golden path stretch toward him like a hand extended. Beyond the threshold, in the pale pool of light, stood the Candle Sisters. Their faces were as pale and smooth as porcelain, but it was their eyes, or rather the absence of them, that rooted him in place. Where pupils should have been, two small, hungry embers burned flickering with the same rhythm as the taper between their hands. The glow from within seemed to hollow their faces from the inside as if they were vessels lit from a fire deep in the chest. He claimed they did not move, did not blink, only tilted their heads in unison as though measuring the weight of his hesitation. When he tried to step back, the hush thickened around him, filling his mouth and nose until he could taste the faint tang of ash. He clapped a hand over his lips to keep from making a sound, but a small involuntary whimper escaped. The sisters' heads lifted sharply at that, the ember light in their sockets flaring. He fled into the snow, stumbling until the glow was lost behind the trees. "The heat followed me home," he said softly, "and I still don't know if it ever left." Agnes Croft's passage. The curate's widow. Agnes Croft had lived 2 years in a fog of grief, her mourning dress hanging from her frame like a shadow that would not be lifted. She rarely ventured past her garden gate, and when she did, it was to attend services with her veil drawn low. But one dawn in early spring she rose with a certainty she would later fail to explain. She stepped barefoot into the mud, her path set toward the orchard. Her hair unpinned hung damp with dew, and between her cupped hands burned a small steady flame that no wind disturbed. Those who saw her pass from the village road said the orchard gates parted for her, the boards shifting aside as though they recognized a right no living soul had earned. The farmer who had halted his cart to watch swore he could hear the hush pour out from the chapel door before she even reached it, a soundless weight that made his horse shiver in its traces. Agnes did not pause. She entered the chapel without looking left or right, her flame disappearing into the glow within. The farmer claimed the hush that issued from the open door was deeper than silence, deeper even than the grave, and that within it he heard two voices, soft and bright as candle flames, greeting her by name. He gripped the fence rail until his knuckles whitened, fighting the urge to follow. By the time the door eased shut, she was gone, leaving no tracks in the wet grass. The change in Agnes. In the weeks after that morning, Agnes Croft was not seen beyond her threshold. Neighbors who called found her cordial enough, seated in her front room beside a guttering lamp, her hands folded in her lap as though in perpetual prayer. Yet her gaze often slid past her visitors, fixed on some point beyond the wall as if she were listening for a sound too faint for other ears. In bright light, the skin of her palms glistened as if coated with fresh wax that never quite dried. When asked about the morning she walked into the chapel, she would smile thinly and say only, "They are waiting." No coaxing, no shared grief from other widows could draw more from her. The orchard behind the chapel, meanwhile, erupted into an unnatural abundance, dense canopies of white blossoms that did not shed even in wind. Children who dared to stand beneath them returned with petals clinging to their hair petals that never browned or withered. One bold boy brought home a branch heavy with flowers, laying it on the hearth. That night the house filled with the scent of burning tallow, and each blossom smoldered with a tiny blue flame. In the morning the branch was whole again, as if the fire had been a dream. The family left it in the lane and barred their door, unwilling to invite whatever presence had followed the petals inside. The orchard's unwelcome wonders. Word of the orchard's unnatural blossoms spread beyond Caro Hollow, drawing strangers from nearby villages. They came on foot or by cart, their faces split between skepticism and a kind of fearful curiosity. Standing at the fence, they peered in at the rows of trees heavy with petals that never fell frost, still glimmering faintly on the bark even beneath the midday sun. Some swore they saw movement between the trunks, a slow shifting of shadow that did not match the flicker of any candle. Others claimed to hear faint singing, a lullaby twined in two voices, both so soft they seemed to brush against the eardrum like moth wings. A few dared to climb the fence, their boots sinking into the grass, but none remained inside longer than a few minutes. They emerged pale and uncertain, their steps slow, as though reluctant to leave. More than one was seen raising an unsteady hand to their chest, as if to reassure themselves their heart still beat in its familiar rhythm. One man, a trader from Old Fox Hollow, admitted later that the longer he stood under the trees, the more the air seemed to thicken, each breath heavy with sweetness that dulled the edges of his thoughts. It was the kind of sweetness that suggested not welcome but surrender, a slow yielding to whatever hush ruled the orchard's heart. By midsummer, the visitors ceased. Whether from fear or respect, the orchard was left alone again, the strangeness within it allowed to deepen without interference. Envy in the village. It was the vestry who eventually decided to shut the gates to the orchard. Publicly, they said it was to protect the curious from harm, but in the quiet exchanges between parish elders, another reason emerged. Envy. Envy that the Candle Sisters had found a place where no grief could reach them, where the hush was so complete it smothered every shadow of loss. In the evenings, villagers still saw the glow behind the chapel windows, unwavering as a vow. It was neither warm nor cold, neither welcoming nor forbidding. It simply endured a flame without fatigue. No matter how warm the summer air grew, the hollow itself remained cool as a crypt, the kind of cool that made even the most mundane tasks, drawing water, splitting wood, feel like intrusions. The sisters themselves were rarely glimpsed now, but their absence did nothing to lessen the sense of their presence. In fact, it seemed stronger, as though the orchard and chapel had become an extension of their joined vigil. Parents instructed their children not to speak the sisters' names after dusk, fearing that words carried in the night air might be heard and answered. And when a candle sputtered out in a window, or a sudden draught stirred the curtains, whole households would pause, holding their breath until the moment passed, wary of inviting that patient hush indoors. The warm boards of the chapel. By the first harvest after the gates were sealed, a strange and uneasy peace had settled over Caro Hollow. The chapel stood with its doors barred and its windows veiled in frost that never melted even in the noonday sun. On warm afternoons, children dared each other to creep close enough to press their palms to the weathered boards. Without fail, They would snatch their hands back, startled by the warmth beneath the grain, a slow, steady heat that seemed to pulse faintly like the beat of some hidden heart. One boy swore he felt that thumping against his skin, regular as a clock, but somehow alive. When he tried to tell his father, the man struck him sharply across the mouth and forbade him to speak of it again. Yet that night the boy woke from sleep with the taste of smoke on his tongue, a sweetness so dense it made his teeth ache. The sensation lingered until morning, long after the candle in the family's hearth had guttered out. Some in the village took to crossing themselves when they passed the chapel, even in broad daylight. Others made longer detours, unwilling to walk within sight of its roof. The building seemed to watch back its frost-laced windows, hiding a light that never dyed its walls, holding a breath that waited for anyone bold enough to push the latch. Agnes's final walk. It was late in September when Agnes Croft stepped beyond her doorway for the last time. She wore her mourning dress, the cuffs stained with wax, the hem dragging in the dust as though it had been carried through miles of candle-lit aisles. In her cupped hands, bare against the chill, glowed a small and steady flame. No wind disturbed it, not even as she walked the length of the lane and into the shadows of the orchard gate. A farmer passing in his cart halted at the sight, his horse trembling beneath the harness. He called out to her, fear or pity warping his voice, but Agnes did not lift her gaze. She passed through the gate without pause. The boards shifted apart as if in recognition, granting her passage to a place no other living soul had entered in months. By the time the farmer gathered his courage to follow, the flame had vanished into the chapel's interior. He approached only as close as the fence, unwilling to step over into the grass that seemed to hush at his presence. From there, he saw the chapel door swing wide on its own, the darkness inside layered with a light so warm it painted the frost-laced air gold. The hush that issued from that threshold was unlike any silence he had known, dense, patient, infinite. Within it, he thought he heard two voices, bright as twin flames, greeting her softly by name. The door closed without haste, and with it the light withdrew, leaving him shivering in the orchard shadow. Agnes Croft was never seen again. Winter's shroud. The frost came early that year, laying silver threads over every branch in the orchard until they resembled trees woven into burial shrouds. The grass beneath turned brittle and white, each blade coated in ice that cracked under the slightest pressure. By mid-October, even the most pragmatic villagers avoided the hollow. The dairyman, once a regular at the rectory, now drove his cart in a wide arc to keep from passing the fence, urging his mare to a brisk trot without looking toward the chapel. Yet despite the living's determination to forget the hush, spread like slow smoke curling down the lanes and seeping beneath door frames. At night, it gathered in the streets, pressing against the windows of those who lay awake. Dreams came, then dreams of the orchard covered in drifting white petals of two girls standing at the clearing's edge with a single candle between them. Its light was soft beckoning, and for some unbearably inviting. These visions left the dreamers with a lingering warmth in the chest, a small ember they could not cool no matter how they tried. The orchard gates remained barred, but the frost stayed as if anchored by the sisters' unseen presence, refusing to lift even under the sharpest sun. Henry Broom's resolve. It was during one such frost-laden night that Henry Broom, the schoolmaster, decided he would be the one to end the village's dread. He told himself it was duty, not curiosity, that the children's fear was a distraction from their studies. and that an adult must set an example by confronting the source. He armed himself with a lantern and a stout walking stick, wrapping his scarf tight against the cold that seemed to grow heavier the closer he drew to the hollow. The hush met him like a solid wall pressing into his ears until his own heartbeat felt like an intrusion. At the orchard gate, he set his lantern down long enough to climb over boots sinking into frost-crusted grass. The chapel door stood closed, yet a thin line of light glowed beneath it, pale and steady as bone under skin. His hand trembled on the latch, though he told himself he was ready for shadows, for nothing, for whatever truth lay within. The warmth struck him first, blooming across his face like the breath of a furnace. Candles burned on every pew, flames rising without flicker. At the altar stood the Candle Sisters, their eyes fixed on him as though they had known the exact moment of his arrival. The hush deepened until it filled every thought. In that moment, Henry felt certain he had always been meant to witness their vigil, as though his life had been quietly leading him to this single point in time. The transformation of Henry Broome. Henry Broome had walked into the chapel a schoolmaster and walked out something else entirely. In the candlelight, he had seen that the sisters' faces were no longer the smooth, untouched features of children. Wax had gathered in delicate ridges along their cheeks, trailing down into the hollows of their throats, glistening as though freshly poured. From the sockets of their eyes, thin ribbons of molten wax slid unhurried, pooling against the soft curve of their jawlines. And yet when their mouths opened, the voice that emerged was not the rasp of something inhuman, but the tender cadence of a lullaby. He would never recall the words, only the sense that they were meant for him, that the syllables had been waiting inside him all his life, for the right moment to surface. When he woke the next morning in his own bed, he found the hush had followed him. It clung to the corners of his house, curled into the spaces between the ticking of the clock, filling every quiet moment with a warmth that was neither comfort nor threat, but something older, like a memory he could not place. In the days that followed, his pupils whispered about his new stillness. He no longer scolded them for shaping small candles from scraps of tallow. When they stumbled over their letters, he did not raise his eyes, but stared instead at the floorboards as though listening for something that pulsed far beneath. He spoke less, but when he did, his words seemed to emerge from a distance as though carried from somewhere beyond the schoolhouse walls. Candlelight in the fog. November brought a dense, marrow-deep fog to Caro Hollow, swallowing the orchard and the churchyard in a pale, featureless veil. Travelers who passed at dawn swore they saw flickers of light gliding through the mist, moving slowly among the gravestones. The lantern-like glow seemed to drift with a deliberate pace, pausing now and then as if to linger at certain markers. A tinker who often took the Hollow's road was found one morning standing in the orchard, his boots sunk into the frost-hardened grass. His hands cupped a candle burned down to a nub. Though the wick had long since gone cold, his palms were blistered as though he had held it while it burned for hours. When asked why he had gone there, he did not speak. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the chapel, and his lips parted in a soundless sob. The vestry called an emergency meeting in the shadow of the chapel, arguing heatedly over whether the building should be pulled down or burned to the roots along with the orchard. Some feared destruction would only bring worse upon them. Others thought leaving the sisters' vigil intact was an invitation to further harm. While they argued, the curate's bell began to toll of its own accord. 12 deep resonant strikes rolled out into the fog, each note vibrating through the bones of every listener. When the last chime faded, not one person dared speak, a silence that felt like a promise. The hush that followed the bell was absolute more than mere absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, thick and deliberate, as though it had been called into being by the bell's last toll. It pressed against the skin, curled into ears, and seemed to slow the heart. In that charged stillness, the vestry's arguments dissolved into lowered gazes and tightened jaws. They never convened again after that night. The chapel door remained closed, its warped boards hiding whatever movement might linger inside. Yet on certain evenings, thin smoke rose from the chimney, pale as ghost breath coiling upward until it shaped itself into something unmistakable. A candle held aloft by unseen hands, its flame steady as a heartbeat. In the village, the hush settled over rooftops like a thin layer of frost, pressing down so gently it could almost be mistaken for a blessing, almost. No one said it aloud, but the sense was shared whatever the sisters were keeping inside the chapel was not finished, and the hush was their way of making sure no one forgot. The orchard slept under its veil, the frost unbroken the air inside it, holding the weight of watchfulness. Those who dared pass the fence could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows the sisters' candle burned on, waiting for its next witness. Winter's sudden claim. Winter did not arrive in Caro Hollow. Gradually that year it claimed the land in a single, deliberate night. Snow fell without wind, blanketing the orchard and chapel, in an undisturbed white so smooth it looked as though some unseen hand had spread it with the care of a funeral shroud. Fires in the village guttered, low shutters were latched tight, and the roads after dark lay empty. The hush deepened, growing heavy enough to be felt in the chest, as though it were pressing against the ribs. Yet the hollow did not feel abandoned. On certain nights, faint movements could be sensed, as if the air itself was shifting within the frost-laced orchard. The glow of the chapel windows would appear suddenly, not the flicker of a hearth, but the unwavering radiance of many candles burning in perfect unison. Villagers whispered that the orchard was being watched over by something that did not tire, did not sleep, and did not belong entirely to the living. A few dared to linger at the fence, tracing the lines of two narrow paths of bare earth, winding through the snow to the chapel door paths that appeared freshly made, though no one had seen a figure walk them. These trails gave the impression not of visitors entering, but of guardians moving back and forth, maintaining a vigil that winter itself seemed unwilling to disturb. The disappearance of Matthew Teague. On the last Sunday of Advent, the quiet in the village broke when 8-year-old Matthew Teague was discovered missing from his bed. His mother found the covers folded neatly as though he had risen calmly in the night. The back door stood ajar, but there was no drift of snow inside. Instead, a thin trail of melted frost led away into the dark, as if small bare feet had pressed the cold into steam. Lanterns were lit, voices calling his name into the white fields, each one thinner than the last in the heavy air. Near dawn, the searchers reached the chapel. Its doors were closed, frost clinging to the hinges, but a steady golden glow spilled from the narrow gap at the bottom. Without warning, the curate's bell began to toll 12 measured strikes, echoing into the hush. Each chime seemed to sink deeper into the bones of those listening until the 12th faded into a silence that made the skin prickle. No one dared to open the door at once. They half expected it to swing wide of its own accord to reveal the boy or perhaps the sisters themselves standing in the light. Instead, nothing moved. The only motion was a thin column of smoke rising from the chimney, vanishing into the pale sky, as if drawn away by invisible hands. A witness, not a sacrifice. When the sun climbed higher, a few of the searchers gathered enough courage to push open the chapel door. Inside the nave was warm, the air thick with the sweetness of melted wax. Every pew bore a single burning candle flames, rising steady in the stillness. At the altar, the candle sisters stood side by side, their hands joined around a taper whose light was brighter than any torch. At their feet lay Matthew wrapped in a quilt no one recognized. His small hands were folded over his chest, and he appeared to be sleeping. Relief and dread mingled in the throats of those who saw him. When he stirred and blinked up at the faces above him, he spoke a single word in a voice that did not sound like his own. "Remember." The word lingered in the chapel like a note struck on a deep bell refusing to fade. His eyes closed again, his breathing settling into the slow rhythm of ordinary sleep. The villagers stood frozen, unwilling to lift him. They understood without exchanging a single word that the sisters had not summoned the boy for harm. He had been brought there to bear witness to something none of them wanted to see too closely. And still none could guess what that meant for him or for them once he awoke. The widow and the boy. It was the sexton's widow, a woman hollowed by grief from years of loss, who finally stepped forward to lift Matthew from the chapel floor. Her skirts whispered across the flagstones as she approached the hush, thickening until it felt almost physical, like a warm fog pressing against her skin. The sisters raised their candle higher, and in that sudden flare she saw their faces clearly for the first time. They were unlined and pale, untouched by years, yet not alive in any way she understood. Wax clung to their skin in delicate ridges, tracing thin channels from the hollows of their eyes down to the smooth curve of their throats. In those wells of shadow, where eyes should have been small, flames burned steadily, not like a reflection, but as though the fire truly lived within them. A question rose unbidden in the widow's mind, one she felt she had carried in her bones since birth, but had never shaped into words. Before she could give it voice, the smaller sister tilted her head and smiled a gesture so tender it struck her like a blow. The weight of her grief shifted, not gone, but softened under the warmth of that impossible light. Without realizing it, she sank to her knees. Matthew's small hands slipped into hers, warm and sure, and when she lifted him, his cheek rested easily on her shoulder. The sisters watched silently as she turned toward the door, their gaze neither pleading nor forbidding, only steady. As she crossed the threshold, the hush retreated behind her, like a tide, leaving only the pale music of the thaw dripping from the eaves. The boys quiet. In the weeks that followed, the village spoke little of that morning. Matthew returned to his bed without fever or complaint, but a stillness clung to him, an inwardness no coaxing could disperse. He spent long hours by the hearth, hands folded in his lap, watching the fire as though it spoke a private language. When asked what he had seen, he met the question without fear or confusion and answered only, "They are waiting." For what, he would not say. Pressed further, he closed his eyes and hummed a tune no one recognized, a melody soft as a lullaby, yet tinged with something older than comfort, something that made the hairs rise on the back of the neck. His mother, unsettled by the sound, forbade further questions. Each night she drew the curtains tight and placed an unlit candle on the window-sill, a silent token against whatever hush might come calling. It was an act of faith or defiance, perhaps both. The villagers, for their part, avoided speaking the sisters' names aloud after sunset. They had all felt the shift in the air since Matthew's return. It was not threat exactly, but an awareness, a subtle listening presence that seemed to hover at the edges of every quiet moment. Spring blossoms that would not fade. Winter bled into spring without ceremony. The thaw crept in slow, uncertain hours, revealing the orchard's branches thick with pale blossoms. Their petals were as soft as breath and as flawless as fresh snow. Some villagers dared to gather them, believing the bloom might be a sign that the sisters' vigil had ended. Yet no matter how many flowers were carried away, the trees remained heavy with white. Those who placed the blossoms in bowls on their tables found they never wilted, never browned. Those who pressed them into the pages of family Bibles discovered the paper beneath had turned translucent, as if a hidden flame had licked the ink from the fibers. Whispers spread that the blossoms were not meant to be taken, that they were part of a living arrangement between the orchard and the sisters, an exchange the living had no place in. By late spring, most chose to leave the flowers where they grew, the orchard again becoming a place no one entered without cause. In the evenings, a faint sweetness drifted on the breeze from that direction, not the scent of fresh bloom, but of wax and smoke braided together, as though each petal held the memory of a candle's flame. The bell beneath the earth. On the eve of Whitsun, when the air lay heavy and still over Caro Hollow, the curate's bell rang once more. No hand touched its rope. No figure moved in the belfry. The sound was thin and distant, as though it rose from far beneath the earth, a single note that quivered in the bones of every listener. Lantern flames in windows flickered low shadows shivering against the walls. In that moment, even the most skeptical villagers felt the hush gather like a tide spilling out from the orchard to press against every door. The note lingered unnaturally long before dissolving into silence. Those who lay awake later confessed that the quiet afterward felt as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to step into the space the sound had left. For some dreams came dreams so vivid they felt more like memories, in which the chapel's doors swung wide, and the candle sisters stepped out into the frost-limbed grass, their candle lifted high. The light in those dreams was not blinding but steady, a glow that seemed to carry the weight of all the nights it had burned. And in every dream, the dreamer knew they were not simply witnessing the sisters' passage. They were being measured, considered as if for a place in a vigil that had no end. The sisters. Unbound. In these shared dreams there were no walls or pews, no gravestones or markers, only the silvered grass underfoot stretching into darkness. The sisters walked without pause, the frost melting in a thin path behind them, steam curling up to vanish into the night. They were no longer bound by the chapel's threshold, nor by the orchard's rose. Whatever tether had once fixed them to the land had loosened or changed. Yet their devotion to each other, to the small, steady flame between them, remained unbroken. Some who dreamed felt certain they were being led somewhere, though the destination was always just beyond the reach of sight. Others felt they were being followed instead, the sisters' candlelight brushing their backs like a warm, persistent hand. When the dreamers woke, the hush lingered in their rooms, and the air carried the faint scent of beeswax and something sharper, like linen singed by a flame. In the days after, a few dared to speak of what they had seen, but most kept silent, unsettled by the idea that the sisters' reach now extended beyond the orchard, beyond the chapel, into the private corners of their own homes and minds. A chapel left to time. In the years that followed, the chapel was left to its quiet decay. The vestry, long dissolved, made no further attempts to reclaim it. The orchard grew dense, its branches arching overhead, until no sky could be seen between them, the ground beneath, locked in perpetual shade. Travelers passing through Caro Hollow spoke of a flickering light weaving between the trees, a flame that never failed, no matter the hour or the season. Some said it was a warning to keep away. Others swore it was a benediction, a promise of protection to those willing to accept it. But all agreed on one truth: the Candle Sisters remained. In the hush, their vigil went on their faces, calm in the glow of a candle that had never burned out. To pass the orchard's edge at night was to feel a warmth bloom against your cheek, a sensation both tender and terrifying. Those who felt it knew better than to turn their heads toward it. The lesson had settled into the marrow of the village: not every light is meant to lead you home. Some burn only to remind the living that devotion once kindled can consume a heart so completely that darkness has no room to enter and no reason to leave. The vigil that would not dim. If you had wandered the road into Caro Hollow in those years after the orchard closed itself to strangers, you might have mistaken the place for a hamlet gone to sleep. The chapel crouched under its blanket of frost, the orchard beyond, swaying only when the wind dared cross its threshold. Yet at night, through the warped windows of the nave, there was always light, a patient, unwavering glow that seemed to pulse with its own slow heartbeat. Those who lingered at the edge of the hollow swore the glow moved from pew to pew, as if two figures passed through the darkness, tending each flame in turn. The hush was deeper now, layered with years of unbroken watch. It was not the brittle quiet of a place abandoned, but the deliberate silence of a space claimed and kept. Children who had been forbidden to speak of the sisters found themselves repeating old rhymes about them in whispers, the words slipping from their tongues without thought, as though the memory had been seeded and left to grow on its own. And always, when the stories were told, the teller's eyes would drift toward the orchard, as if expecting to see a faint shape there, candlelight brushing against the frost. The winter that would not leave. The winter that followed was remembered as the longest in living memory. Snow came in early December and did not melt until the first days of May. Drifts buried hedgerows and sealed doorways, bowing the chapel's roof beneath their weight. For weeks at a time, the road to Caro Hollow vanished into a blank white expanse so featureless it seemed to strip the mind of its bearings, and yet curiously, the frost never touched the chapel's threshold. Even at the height of the blizzards, two narrow trails of bare earth led from the orchard gate to the door, their lines perfect and unbroken. Those who dared draw near described them in hushed voices, the warmth that bled from the ground, there raising steam in the frigid air. It was as though unseen feet had passed only moments before keeping the path alive against the cold. More troubling still was the glow that seeped from between the warped boards of the nave. It was too steady to be moonlight, too warm to be ice. Those who saw it claimed they could hear, if they stood still long enough, a faint crackling like wicks catching in the dark. It was a sound that tightened the skin at the back of the neck, a reminder that something inside the chapel burned without pause, indifferent to the seasons outside. The dairyman's return to the wall. One night in late January, a dairyman long known for his wariness of the hollow found himself lost in the snow after a delivery. The storm had hidden every landmark, and by the time the wind stilled, he realized with a sinking heart that he was standing near the orchard's edge. From behind a low wall he saw the chapel door drift inward, though the air was perfectly still. From that gap spilled a path of light so bright it gilded the snow, leading straight toward him. The scent of warm honey rose in the hush, curling into his lungs before he could turn away. And then he heard them, two young voices, reciting something in unison. The words were too faint to catch, yet their rhythm was deliberate, like a lesson being recited to a teacher no longer living. Against his better judgment, he leaned out from the wall. The door opened wider, and there they were, the Candle Sisters, standing exactly as the stories promised, their faces pale in the blaze of the taper between them. Shadows of their small bodies stretched impossibly tall along the nave walls, wavering like reeds in a current. Where their eyes should have been, two embers glowed with a hunger that was neither cruel nor kind, only certain. The dairyman clapped a hand to his mouth to stifle the sound that rose in his throat, but the hush seemed to drink it in. The sisters' heads lifted in perfect unison, and in that instant he fled the heat of their unseen fire, chasing him into the snow. Thor and the Petals. When the Thor finally came to Caro Hollow, it arrived not in slow increments, but as if some invisible hand had lifted a curse in a single measured breath. Overnight, the snow receded, revealing the orchard slick with meltwater. Across the wet ground lay scattered petals, too white to be blossoms from any tree in season, each one soft as parchment worn thin by time. At dawn, villagers crept to the fence drawn by the strange sight. The air was heavy with a scent no one could agree upon. Some swore it was honey thick and warm. Others smelled tallow, faintly acrid. A few whispered it was closer to the sweetness of something long dead preserved beyond its rightful hour. Along the chapel's eaves hung thin ropes of wax like icicles, frozen mid-drip, each thread ending in a bead that trembled but never fell. Where the frost had retreated from the threshold, two pairs of footprints pressed deep into the thawed earth. They were small, bare, and perfectly side by side, leading only one way into the chapel. From within came the slow trickle of water running toward the open door, warm against the still cold ground it crossed, vanishing before it reached the steps. Those who lingered too long felt the hush building again, a low, almost imperceptible pull, as if the orchard itself was deciding whether to let them remain. Agnes Croft's last pilgrimage. It was Agnes Croft, the curate's widow, who first crossed the orchard fence that spring. She had buried her husband 2 years before, laying him in the churchyard, with the same hymns he had once sung for others, yet her mourning had never softened. On this morning she rose with a conviction she could not explain, an unshakable certainty that she must see the Candle Sisters with her own eyes. Barefoot, she stepped into the cold mud, the chill squelching between her toes, but she did not falter. She moved through the orchard as though following a path she had walked 100 times in dreams. When she reached the chapel door, she pushed it wide without hesitation. Warmth met her first, a heavy golden heat scented unmistakably with burning linen. Her vision blurred, and in that shimmering haze she saw the pews crowded with figures, men and women, young and old, their faces pale and still as funeral masks. Each held a candle cupped in both hands, the flames casting thin halos against the rafters. At the foot of the altar stood the sisters, unchanged, their damp braids hanging over spotless white night dresses. The candle between them burned steady as a vow. Agnes stepped forward once, and every head in that impossible congregation turned toward her in unison. No voice rose, no hand lifted, yet the hush thickened until her own heartbeat felt like a trespass, claimed by the flame. The sisters raised their candle, tilting it toward the floor. Wax spilled in a slow, deliberate arc, splashing across the flagstones at Agnes's bare feet. She tried to move, but her body refused her command, as though the warmth rooting her in place was alive. The wax rolled over her toes, warm as blood, and in that moment she understood what no one had dared speak, that some lights are not meant to guide the lost, but to claim them entirely. The heat traveled up her legs, not searing, but suffusing her with a profound stillness. The faces around her watched without blinking. Then the world shifted. She was standing outside the chapel in the orchard's first light. The door behind her closed her palms, sticky with cooling wax. She had no memory of leaving, no sense of how she'd crossed the threshold. In the days that followed, Agnes was seen less and less. When neighbors visited, she greeted them kindly but distantly, her gaze sliding past them as though tuned to another frequency. The wax on her palms never faded. In bright light, it gleamed fresh. And when anyone asked what she had seen that morning, she would only smile, thin absent, and murmur, "They are waiting." The orchard's strange flourish. In the weeks after Agnes Croft's return, the orchard behind the chapel grew with a vigor no one in Caro Hollow could recall. White blossoms swelled thick on every branch, forming canopies so dense they blocked the sun, their petals trembling at the slightest breeze. The frost that had once clung to the bark was gone, but the air beneath the trees remained cool, almost damp, carrying that same braided scent of bloom and melted wax. Children dared each other to slip under the branches and return with a handful of petals, but the flowers clung stubbornly to their stems. Even when torn free, the petals showed no sign of wilting, no bruise from rough fingers. One boy, emboldened by his friends, carried home a whole branch heavy with blossoms. That night, the house filled with the scent of burning tallow. Each flower smoldered with a tiny blue flame, their light flickering against the rafters without consuming the petals. The boy's father doused them with a wet rag until the glow died, but in the morning the branch was whole again, unmarked by fire. They left it in the lane for the wind to take and barred their door against any further marvels. From that point on, most of the villagers avoided the orchard entirely, letting the trees and whatever lived within them keep their own counsel, strangers at the fence. Word of the orchard's unnatural beauty and its unsettling reputation spread slowly to the neighboring townships. By midsummer, small knots of strangers began arriving in Caro Hollow. They came on foot in carts or on horseback, their faces shadowed by broad-brimmed hats, their clothes travel-worn. Some stood at the orchard fence for hours, simply watching the rows of white bloom. A few claimed to see movement deep between the trunks, a slow shifting that might have been wind if not for the complete stillness of the air. Others reported hearing two voices singing a tune that seemed to weave through the branches, without origin, both sweet and sorrowful, as if it had been carried across great distances. Occasionally, one or two would climb the fence, moving cautiously under the blossoms, but they never stayed long. When they emerged, their eyes seemed glassy, their steps slow, as though they were still walking in a place far removed from the hollow. One man was seen raising an unsteady hand to his chest, pressing his palm there as if to remind himself of the rhythm within. Whatever they found beyond the first row of trees, none described it in detail. The ones who crossed the threshold. Not all visitors were content to linger at the orchard's edge. One late summer evening, 2 men arrived carrying iron rods and storm lanterns. They announced loudly to a cluster of curious villagers that they intended to prove the Candle Sisters were nothing more than a local ghost story. The orchard gates, still nailed shut by the vestry years before, opened for them with a groan, though no one touched them. The men strode toward the chapel, their boots loud against the hush, and forced the heavy doors wide. Those watching from the fence glimpsed only the flare of their lanterns, swallowed by the darkness inside. The minutes stretched lantern light, shifting once twice, then vanishing altogether. No sound followed, not the scrape of boots, not the ring of metal on stone. By morning the doors hung open, swaying gently as if moved by a breeze, but the men were gone. There were no footprints leaving the chapel, no broken boards or signs of struggle. The only trace left was the faint warmth that clung to the air inside and the smell of extinguished wax. The villagers did not organize a search. In Caro Hollow, when someone disappeared into the hush, they were considered already beyond retrieval. Their names were spoken once in the tavern, lowered to a whisper, and then not at all. Figures. Beneath the water. Autumn rains flooded the orchard, pooling between the rows until the ground mirrored the sky. The frost that once clung to every tree persisted on their bark, silvering the black limbs, even as the water rose around them. Children unable to resist the lure of the forbidden climbed the fence to peer inside. What they saw drove most of them running home, white-faced and trembling. Beneath the still surface moved 2 familiar shapes, the Candle Sisters, their matching grey dresses undisturbed by the current. Their hair drifted around their shoulders like strands of pale river weed. In their joined hands, they held a slender candle, its flame burning with an uncanny blue light that neither flickered nor dimmed even under water. The light seemed to bend towards something deeper below them, as if illuminating a path in the darkness beneath the roots. Whispers ran through the village. Was this a vision, a trick of the water, or a sign of the sisters' complete severance from the rules that bound the living? A traveling fisherman, hearing the tale in the tavern, refused to take the Hollows road the next day, choosing instead a winding route through the hills. That kind of light, he said, isn't meant for our eyes. If you look long enough, you might find it looking back. The failed consecration. By the Feast of All Souls, the vestry resolved to reclaim the chapel once and for all. A blessing they thought might sever the sisters' hold. The curate led a small procession, brass censer in hand, its smoke curling in pale grey threads. But when the chapel doors were forced open, the congregation froze on the threshold. The nave blazed with the light of hundreds of candles, each flame upright and steady, untouched by any draught. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, and something fainter, metallic like blood warmed by a hand. No one moved inside the glow. It felt less like a welcome and more like stepping into the gaze of something vast and patient. The curate tried to speak the first words of the rite, but they caught in his throat. The hush pressed down on them all, a weight that made the lungs ache. One by one they turned away, retreating into the cold. The chapel doors closed on their own, the light inside undiminished. The blessing was never attempted again. "You don't bless what already belongs to itself," the sexton's wife murmured afterward, and no one argued. Winter's creep into the village. That winter came hard and sudden, the frost painting every pane and sealing the wells in brittle ice. But the hush did not stay contained in the hollow. It crept outward, curling along the roads, slipping under doors. The village took on a strange quiet after sundown. No songs were sung by the fire, no arguments spilled from the tavern. The hush was not oppressive in the way of grief, it was deliberate waiting, as if the whole place had been drawn into the sisters' long vigil. Children who woke in the night swore they heard soft footsteps just beyond their windows, a faint tapping like knuckles brushing against the glass. Parents told them it was only branches in the wind, though no wind stirred the frost-coated trees. The glow in the chapel windows was seen more often now, a steady warmth in the distance that made even the most practical farmer pause mid-task. His hands, slack eyes drawn toward that constant light. The boy at the fence won. Late afternoon, when the sky was the color of old pewter, a boy not more than 12 dared to test the orchard's gates. He'd been dared by other children to see if the wood was still warm as old stories claimed. The frost-crusted boards bit at his fingertips, but beneath there was heat, a slow, steady throb like a heartbeat. He pressed his whole palm against it, startled at the pulse that seemed to match his own. It was faint at first, then stronger until his hand tingled, as though the warmth were climbing up his arm. Something in that rhythm unnerved him. He yanked his hand back and bolted for the road, but for days afterward he swore he could still feel the thumping in his palm. He hid it from his parents, but at night, when lying still, he could hear it faintly in his ears, like the echo of a distant bell counting something down. The return of Agnes Croft. Months after she vanished into the chapel, Agnes Croft was seen again. She walked the road at twilight, her mourning dress heavy with dust, the cuffs still stained with wax. Between her cupped hands burned a small, unwavering flame. She moved as though following a path only she could see. A farmer halted his cart as she approached, calling out her name, but she didn't glance his way. The orchard gate parted for her without touch. The boards shifted aside like old friends making room at a table. The farmer shaken tied his horse and crept after her, but stopped at the fence. Through the rows of trees he saw the chapel door swing open, spilling light so rich and warm it seemed to hum. From the darkness inside came two voices, bright as candle flames, speaking her name in unison. The door closed with patient finality. Agnes Croft was never seen again. Early frost. The first frost came weeks earlier than anyone expected, frosting the orchard's branches in lacework silver, while the fields beyond were still green. The effect was unnerving, like a winter scene dropped whole into the wrong season. The grass under the trees was brittle white, and the air there carried a dry cold that bit harder than the season allowed. By mid-October, the frost had thickened into a kind of glaze that no midday sun could touch. Even the most skeptical villagers began avoiding the hollow. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the sensation of stepping into a room where something important was happening, but you weren't meant to be there. The hush in the night. As the frost deepened, the hush spread again into the village. This time it came with a heaviness in the lungs, as though the air itself were thickened. People woke from dreams of petals drifting over their faces, the scent of beeswax in their nostrils, and two small figures at the clearing's edge. Always there was a single candle between them, burning with a soft, beckoning glow. These dreams left behind a faint warmth in the chest that lingered well into the day. Some tried to pray it away. Others kept silent, unsure whether the feeling was blessing or warning. The glow in the chapel windows never faltered. Henry Broom's decision. Henry Broom, the schoolmaster, was among those who dreamt of the sisters. For weeks he'd resisted the pull of that light, telling himself it was only fancy bred from gossip. But on a night when the hush pressed so tightly against his door he thought the air might stop altogether, he rose, lit a lantern, and set out for the orchard. He told himself it was duty, that the children's fear was undermining their lessons, and he must be the one to banish it. Yet each step felt less like choice and more like submission. The hush parted for him at the gate, curling inward as he passed, and the chapel's thin seam of light waited ahead, pale as bone, within the chapel. When Henry opened the door, warmth flooded his face like the breath of a furnace. The nave was lined with candles, each flame so still it seemed painted in place. At the altar, the sisters stood, waiting, their heads tilted in perfect symmetry, their eyes fixed on him, steady and unblinking. The hush inside was deeper than outside, so deep he could feel it shaping the beat of his heart. For a long moment no one moved. Then the sisters raised their candle between them, and in that white flare he saw that their faces were no longer entirely human. Wax ridged their cheeks, trailed from their eyes, pooling at their throats. Yet the voice that came when they opened their mouths was soft, melodic, a sound that bent his will without force. Henry's return. He woke in his own bed before dawn, unable to recall leaving the chapel, but the hush was with him, curling in the corners of the room. In the weeks that followed, he no longer corrected the children when they whispered the sisters' names or fashioned crude candles from scraps of tallow. His gaze rarely met theirs. Instead, he seemed to be listening for something beneath their voices, as though waiting for a sound they couldn't hear. The villagers noticed the change, but spoke of it only in low tones. They had seen it before in others who'd gone too far into the hollow and returned. Candlelight in the fog. Late that November, fog rolled into Caro Hollow, thick as wool, swallowing the orchard and chapel in a colorless blur. Travelers passing at dawn swore they saw candlelight drifting through the mist, weaving slowly among the gravestones. It did not sway like a lantern, but glided, pausing now and again as if to linger at certain stones. A tinker was found standing in the orchard one morning, his hands cupped around a candle burned to the nub. The wick was cold, but his palms were blistered as though it had burnt there for hours. When asked why he had gone, he only turned toward the chapel and wept in a dry, papery voice. The villagers did not press him for more. They knew the hush well enough to recognize when it had claimed another witness. The Black Wick. In the weeks after the fog's arrival, a new rumor took root in the tavern. Someone claimed to have seen a candle in the chapel, unlike any other, a thick, pale column with a wick as black as soot. It burned without casting shadow, as if the light itself was swallowed before it could reach the walls. The few who believed the story said the sisters kept this candle for their most solemn work, lighting it only when they meant to seal a pact or draw a soul fully into their keeping. No one could say what such a pact entailed, but the thought of it worked its way into the dreams of the villagers. They they woke with the image of that black wick etched behind their eyelids, a small steady fire that promised nothing and demanded everything. The midwife's confession, old Ruth Garrison, who had delivered nearly every child in Caro Hollow for 40 years, made her confession in a fit of fever. She spoke of a night decades ago when she was called to the orchard to tend a birth. The parents were strangers, their faces half hidden in the candlelight. Ruth swore the twins she delivered that night were not quite right. Their skin was cool as stone, their eyes a pale, waxy blue. The sisters had stood at the foot of the bed, each holding a candle, their flames bending toward the newborns as if tasting them. When Ruth tried to leave, her skirts caught on something at the door. She looked down to see a thin strand of melted wax stretching from her hem to the candle nearest her. She cut it with her shears and never spoke of it until the fever took her mind and loosened her tongue. She died before the day was out, the smell of beeswax thick in her room, frost at the threshold. By midwinter, the frost at the orchard's gate had thickened into an almost architectural crust. It climbed the boards like climbing ivy, intricate and sharp, and never melted even on days when the sun burned pale and low in the sky. The frost's edges glittered like tiny teeth, and when the wind blew just right, it whispered a faint brittle sound, like paper tearing far away. Those who lingered near claimed the whispers were in pairs, two voices murmuring at once, too soft to understand, but steady as breathing. The blacksmith's apprentice, daring himself, pressed his ear to the frozen wood. He swore he heard his own name spoken, and not once, but twice each in a different voice. The disappearance of Sarah Bell. Sarah Bell, a merchant's daughter from the next county, came to Caro Hollow to visit kin. She was seen walking the lane one grey afternoon, pausing to watch the chapel's windows. Her cousin later said she'd asked strange questions over supper, whether the sisters ever spoke to outsiders, whether the orchard's frost could be broken. That night she left her bed without cloak or lantern. In the morning, her footprints led straight to the orchard gate, where they stopped. No sign of struggle, no trace of return. Only a small patch of melted frost on the lowest rail, as though warmed by a hand. The candlemaker's visit. A candlemaker from the coastal city arrived one snowy morning, claiming kinship to no one but business with the chapel. He brought no cart, only a leather satchel heavy with tools and wax. The villagers watched from behind curtains as he crossed the hollow. He never knocked. The chapel doors opened for him. For 3 days the windows burned brighter than ever, the light shifting through colors, gold rose, then a deep crimson that made the snow look like stained glass. On the 4th morning the doors opened again, and the candlemaker walked out alone, his satchel empty. He left without a word, and from then on a faint red glow sometimes joined the chapel's usual gold. The widow's candle. Martha Linney, widowed for 20 years, found a candle on her doorstep in the shape of clasped hands. She had not set foot near the hollow since her husband's burial, yet something in the smooth wax, the tender fold of the fingers, made her keep it. She lit it one evening, and as the flame took the room filled with the scent of her husband's pipe tobacco, she sat for hours, speaking softly to the empty chair by the fire, answering questions she had never dared say aloud. When the candle burned down, she was smiling faintly, though she could not remember what had been said. She locked the stub of wax in a drawer and never lit another. The glass jar. A glass jar appeared in the chapel's porch one morning, sealed with black wax. Inside, floating in clear oil, was a single wick, unlit, but glistening as though it had been dipped in molten gold. A boy who dared to shake the jar swore the wick shivered in response. The object vanished by nightfall, taken by unseen hands. Afterward, those who passed the chapel claimed the candlelight seemed sharper, each flame edged in gold, casting shapes on the walls that didn't match the figures in the pews. The silent bells. For as long as anyone remembered, the chapel's bells had been mute. Their ropes rotted, their tongues rusted. But one foggy dawn, a sound rang over the hollow, not the bright peal of iron on iron, but a deep, slow toll, like a knuckle tapping on wood. It came 12 times, then stopped. No one admitted to hearing it from inside the village, but the shepherd on the ridge swore he saw the chapel's bell ropes moving on their own, the knots looping in a rhythm like braiding hair. The man in the smoke. During a rare thaw, smoke rose from the chapel's chimney for the first time in years. The air carried the scent of tallow and something darker, a char that bit the throat. A hunter following the ridge swore he saw a man's face in the smoke, long, pale, and expressionless, like a mask. It turned slowly toward him before the wind sheared it apart. That night, the hunter dreamed of the sisters flanking the masked man in the nave, each holding a candle whose flame bent toward the center figure. When he woke, his house smelled faintly of beeswax. The Candle Path. One snowy night, a line of candles appeared along the main road, each one sunk into the snow so the flame burned at knee height. They led from the village square all the way to the orchard's gate, where the last candle was taller than the rest, its wax shaped like an open door. The villagers woke to find them still burning their flames untouched by wind or snow. By midday, the candles were gone, leaving only shallow impressions in the ice. No one admitted to following them, though the cooper's youngest son was seen days later wearing a length of white wick around his wrist. The unfinished prayer. The curate, worn thin by months of quiet dread, finally attempted another prayer for the village. He stood in the square at dusk, the book open in his hands. But when he reached the invocation, the words faltered. It was not fear that stopped him. It was the sound of another voice speaking the prayer in perfect unison coming from behind him. He turned, but no one stood there. The voice continued without him, ending in a slow, deliberate Amen. In the hush that followed, the chapel windows bloomed with light, and the curate closed the book without another word. The Night of 12 Flames. They called it the Night of 12 Flames because there were 12 doorways in Caro Hollow that woke to find a candle burning on the threshold. No wax spilled, no telltale smear from a human hand, just a perfect cylinder of pale tallow with the wick already alive. The flames were odd in their steadiness, refusing the tremor of dawn breezes, refusing even the persuasion of a cupped breath. Most folk had neither the courage nor the superstition to step over them, and those who had the courage found the hush itself would not permit the crossing. Stand long enough before one of those lights, and you felt the pressure of an unseen palm at your chest, a patient insistence that the proper path was backward, not forward. The 12 houses formed no obvious pattern. A cooper's cottage, the curate's parlor, the wheelwright's loft, a widow's stoop, the schoolmaster's lintel. Yet when traced on a map, the placements made a ring, whose center, drawn with a string and nail, fell precisely on the chapel's belfry. Children gathered at safe corners to whisper which door bore a flame and what it meant. Old men took measurements with twine and muttered about radii they could not name. The curate, thin with loss of sleep, tried his prayer again at the square's edge. His voice failed where it always failed, in the invocation's hinge, where human speech is asked to borrow breath from elsewhere. By afternoon the candles guttered one by one, not with smoke, but with a soft inhalation, as if each flame were taken back into a lung. On the stoops remained faint circles of warmth that bled slowly into the board. No sign of dripping, no scorch. Only the troublesome feeling that midnight had borrowed noon's face, crossed the village, and returned what it had taken in a form that could not be portioned or refused. The ledger that turned itself after the night of 12 flames. The schoolmaster, Henry Broom, already changed, took to spending his afternoons alone in the chapel's shadow, a book open but unread in his hands. One dusk he rose and walked not to the door, but to the small vestry window where years ago Reverend Fitch had kept the parish ledger. The shelf was bare dust, like sifted flour, gathering in its corners. Henry reached without expectation and touched wood. Something moved beneath his fingers. From the gloom slid a volume swaddled in age, the ledger itself, its leather, cool as river stone. He carried it to the sill and opened where the weight commanded. The pages did not flutter with the wind. They turned with a deliberation that belonged to a living reader, pausing at entries as if to confirm the year the witness. The sum for coal, the children christened, the departed, blessed. Far in the back, in a hand surely Fitch's, stood a final line, small as a hair, they have been patient. Then, just below, a second line appeared as Henry watched ink welling from no pen, a sentence writing itself, with the slowness of sap. We have learned to be likewise. The words lay on the page like a window newly cut. Henry shut the book and pressed its cover to his breast, feeling a heat that was not from his body. He returned it to the shelf, but the ledger did not stay. Each day it came forward a thumb's breadth, as if it meant to meet whoever next would read. The village agreed without saying, so that the ledger should be left to its own errand. In a place where candles walked and winter listened, a book that turned its own leaves was the least dangerous of curiosities, the last of the tallow letters. Spring, when it finally dared unfurl, carried with it a new pulse of post, not bills, not orders for grain, but the familiar parchment sealed in tallow rather than wax. The first wave years ago had read, "We are becoming what she asked of us." Those lines had refused the stove's persuasion and slept under the curate's bed like teeth kept in a box. Now came a second wave, the same cramped hand, the same angular impatience of stroke. Only the sentence had shifted by the width of a word. We have become what she asked of us. No signature, no date. On the reverse of one, a smear of something that looked like ash but smelled of honey. The curate gathered the letters and read them to no one. Reading them aloud felt like cutting the rope on a bell you could not unring. He tried again to burn them, not from defiance, but from a schoolchild's wish to tidy the slate. This time the edges did not blacken. They blanched, turning pale as fat, and from the fibers rose a faint warmth that traveled through his fingers into his wrists, up the arm like wine. He set them down and walked outside until the air took the heat back. That night, every house that had received a letter placed it in the pantry or the bread box or beneath the water pail, anywhere a domestic mercy might leach the strangeness out. It did not. In the morning, each sheet lay where it had been left, but the tallow seal, once dull, shone as if freshly poured. The village learned the only fitting thing to do with such words was to memorize them without agreeing and to keep their mouths shut when the hush came to listen. The procession without footsteps. On the first Sunday after Whitsun, the road held a shimmer, heat without heat, like breath spread thin across glass. At twilight, the shimmer thickened into light, and from the orchard's gate there issued what could only be called a procession, though no foot broke the dust. The Candle Sisters came first, hands joined around their taper. Beside them, offset by inches as in a saint painter's habit, walked a third figure made only of radiance, a column of gold that narrowed where a throat would be and widened where a heart sits. Behind this triad drifted rows upon rows of small flames, each no taller than a cupped hand, as if the pew candles had unseated themselves for the walk. The village lined the square, but did not crowd it. Hats came off, knees bent not from piety, but from the sensible knowledge that standing too tall under a storm is a way to meet lightning. The flames passed every door, lingering before those that had held one of the 12. Where they lingered, a warmth touched the watchers' cheeks, neither burning nor cure, simply a reminder of the temperature at which wax forgets its shape. No sound accompanied the pageant save a thread fine humming in two voices. When it ended, if such things end, the flames returned to the orchard as neatly as they had come, and the sisters with them, leaving the square as it had been except for the smell of clean linen and the lightness in the knees of several men who had sworn in other seasons that nothing unmeasured could move them. The gate that would not break. There are always a few who cannot abide a boundary that insists upon itself. 3 of them, able-bodied, stubborn, not unkind, but untaught by restraint, came with axes to the orchard's nailed gate. The first swing bit the wood, and then withdrew without a chip, as if the blade had struck hide. The second swing skittered sideways, as though the hinge had turned to look at it. The third strike the axeman did not complete. Between shoulder and wrist there rose a heaviness like sleep, and his hands forgot the tool. The others mocked him until they too lifted their blades and felt the same drowse move across the bones, the same syrup gather in the joints. It was not pain. It was consent being asked of muscle and denied. A girl no older than the sisters had been at the bridge, stepped from the watching ring and touched the gate with her fingertips. "Warm," she said softly, and lifted her hand as if from a cat's flank. The men retreated with good humor, roughly stapled to their faces, swearing they would return at dawn with wedges and a sledge. They did not. In the night, each dreamed he swung again, and with every arc the wood turned to flesh, and with every strike the hush said, "No," in 2 voices at once, which is the same as yes, but not for you. In the morning, the gate bore the marks of weather, only a frost gloss along its grain, a patience in its boards that made mockery look the smaller sin. After that, the orchard boundary became less a line to challenge than a door that had already decided who counted as a knock. The candles that faced each other when spring came. The 12 candles on the altar remained untouched, their wicks pale as if they had never known flame. Yet anyone who entered the chapel swore the air was warmer near them, carrying a faint, salt-sweet scent, like water left in a silver bowl under the moon. They had been set in a perfect ring, each facing inward, but over the weeks they began to turn slowly, almost imperceptibly, until they faced one another in pairs, as though conferring in silence. Children dared each other to stand inside the ring, but none made it past the threshold. before their legs buckled, claiming they felt as if a hand had pressed against their chest. At night, some villagers noticed a faint glow seeping through the chapel shutters, pulsing in a steady rhythm as if in time with a breath too large for any living thing. By the end of April, the candles had rotated a full half circle, each pair perfectly aligned with the next, and in the center of the ring, there was now a patch of stone that shimmered faintly as though wet. No one wanted to look directly at it, for fear they might see their own reflection there, tilted, delayed, or smiling when they were not. The day the river reversed. One Sunday morning, while the bell was being rung for service, the river that bordered the north end of the hollow began to run backward. At first it was subtle, an eddy turning the wrong way, a curl of foam drifting upstream. But within an hour, the current was a steady pull toward the orchard's direction. Fish leapt as if startled awake, their scales flashing in the gray light. The old mill wheel spun in reverse, groaning like a door pulled from its hinges. Villagers gathered at the bank in uneasy silence, some murmuring that the river was returning to where it came from, carrying messages, debts, or names. Agnes Croft was seen walking along the opposite bank, her dress dry despite the spray eyes fixed on the water. At the orchard's edge, the current vanished entirely, sinking into the earth without a ripple. Those who dared approach said the ground there was soft underfoot, and when pressed, it gave off a faint warmth as though something below was breathing. The reversal lasted until sunset, and when the water resumed its proper course, the mill wheel stood still, as if unwilling to turn forward again. The naming of the trees. That summer, the children of Caro Hollow began speaking of the trees that had names. At first, adults assumed it was just another game like the ones they used to play about the hollow noon. But then the parents noticed the children could not be persuaded to cut through the orchard path anymore, not even in daylight. Each tree, the children claimed, whispered a name as they passed, but the names were not the ones they knew from the village. They were older, longer, filled with sounds that caught in the throat. A boy said one tree had whispered his grandmother's maiden name, though she had died long before he was born. A girl swore hers had told her a name she must keep safe until the wick is lit. The most unsettling part was that the children never spoke these names aloud except once, just after waking eyes, still cloudy mouths, forming syllables they would later swear they didn't remember. Some parents tried to forbid orchard talk altogether, but the names seemed to follow the children into their dreams, and no one could quite say whether the trees were speaking to them or through them. The door beneath the pews. In late August, during a repair to the chapel's flooring, a loose plank was pried up to reveal a hollow space beneath the pews. At the far end of this cavity was a small iron-bound door, its hinges sunk deep into the stone foundation. There was no keyhole, only a ring set in the center, darkened with age. Those present swore the ring was warm to the touch, as if it had been held in someone's palm just moment before. The curate insisted it be left alone, but that night several villagers returned with lanterns. When the ring was pulled, the door opened with a sigh that smelled of river water and candle smoke. Inside was a flight of narrow steps descending into darkness. One man went down with a rope tied at his waist, calling back each few steps, his voice growing fainter until it was swallowed completely. The rope went slack. They pulled it up, but it came back cleanly severed as if cut by something that had no edge. The door was shut and nailed fast, but by morning the nails were gone, and the ring lay flat against the stone, turning ever so slightly as if it were winding itself for another opening. The sisters in the river light. As the harvest moon rose in September, the villagers gathered on the north bank to watch the river's surface shimmer with a light not from the sun or moon. It was a deep, gold-white glow that seemed to come from beneath the water, moving in long ribbons toward the orchard. Within that light, shapes began to form two figures in long, unbroken gowns, hair spread like currents, eyes closed as if listening to something no one else could hear. The Candle Sisters drifted forward without breaking the surface, their mouths moving in perfect unison, though no sound reached the shore. A few villagers swore they could read the shapes of the words, invitations, bargains, or blessings. Then, without warning, the figures sank, the light folding inward and vanishing into a single point that pulsed once before going dark. The only sound was the faint lapping of the current, and somewhere far off the low toll of the chapel bell, though no one was there to ring it. From that night on, the river never again ran clear. It carried a faint golden haze, as if it were holding the sisters' reflections just beneath its skin. The bells that wouldn't stop. The first frost came early that year, and with it a strange persistence in the chapel bell. It began one morning at dawn, a single toll that rolled across the hollow like a wave of iron. But instead of fading into silence, the sound lingered as though trapped between the hills, vibrating in the bones of anyone within earshot. The bell never rang again in the traditional sense, it simply continued. Even when the rope was cut, the sound remained neither growing louder nor fading, but settling into the air like a constant reminder of something unfinished. At night, people swore they could hear words in its resonance, low murmurs that hinted at instructions or perhaps invitations. Some villagers packed and left before winter deepened, unable to sleep under that unceasing hum. Those who stayed found themselves timing their speech and footsteps to it, as if living in sync with a pulse that was not their own. By the solstice, the bell's tone had changed subtly, no longer the flat clang of metal, but a layered harmony, as though other unseen bells were answering from beneath the earth. The procession without footsteps. On the longest night of the year, a line of figures was seen moving through the orchard, their shapes lit faintly from within, as if they carried their own glow. There was no sound of walking, no crunch of snow, no shift of clothing, only the steady forward motion toward the chapel. They were neither fast nor slow, but measured, each turn of the head perfectly mirrored by the one behind. Those watching from their windows claimed the figures passed through the locked gate rather than opening it. The last in line was taller than the rest, its head crowned with a ring of something that shimmered faintly, like wet leaves in moonlight. Inside the chapel, the candles on the altar flared all at once, their flames bending inward as though drawn toward a single point above the stone floor. The figures vanished into that light, leaving no sign they had been there, except for the faint smell of beeswax and river water that lingered until dawn. The night of the split, shadows, January, brought nights so cold the orchard trees seemed carved from bone. On one such night, a curious thing happened. The moon rose full and pale, and every living person in the hollow cast two shadows. One stretched in the proper direction away from the moonlight, while the other leaned toward it darker, sharper, moving half a beat ahead of its owner. People tried to outrun them, but the second shadow always returned, sometimes appearing on walls or ceilings where no light could have thrown it. In the orchard, the split shadows grew restless, slipping from their owners entirely, and moving along the ground like ink poured into water. A few merged at the base of certain trees, after which the bark took on a human-like texture, as though the trees were remembering a body they had once held. By morning the second shadows were gone, but those who had seen them found their own first shadows subtly altered, longer, narrower, and sometimes smiling when they themselves were not. The door in the water. In late winter, as the river ice began to break, something appeared in the center of the current, a dark, perfectly rectangular shape that did not move with the flow. It was a door, wooden, iron-banded, standing upright, as if set into invisible hinges. No one could say how deep it went, but the water around it swirled in slow, deliberate circles. A group of young men tried to row toward it, but their boat seemed to push away from the door no matter how they steered. From the bank it was clear that the door's surface was shifting not from the water's motion, but from images forming across the grain faces, branches the flicker of candle flames. One afternoon the door swung open without a sound, revealing not darkness, but the orchard in full bloom, lit by a golden sun that was not the one in the sky. It closed again in less than a minute, and when it did, the river ice reformed around it as though sealing a wound. The orchard that stood inside. By the time spring came again, it was no longer clear where the orchard ended and the village began. Shadows of its branches appeared on houses, far from its edge, swaying to a wind no one could feel. In the chapel, the stone circle at the altar had deepened into a shallow basin, and in it lay water that reflected only the orchard, no matter what angle it was viewed from. On the night before Easter, the basin overflowed not onto the floor, but upward, spilling light that curled into branches and blossoms until the entire chapel was filled with a ghostly orchard. The trees were silent, but their blossoms drifted down and dissolved into the air, leaving behind a scent of river mud and beeswax. By morning, the vision was gone, but something had shifted in the people who saw it. They spoke less, listened more. And when they looked toward the orchard, it was with the quiet acceptance of those who knew it had been standing inside them all along. The feast. No one cooked. On the first warm night of April, long tables appeared in the village square. Old oak planks balanced on barrels, each one laden with food. The dishes were not the kind the villagers usually made. There were loaves of dark bread flecked with seeds no one recognized, bowls of honey so thick they held the imprint of the moonlight, and roasted meats that smelled faintly of river reeds. No one had seen these tables brought in, nor could they find a single scrap of ash or coal to suggest cooking fires. The children swarmed, first laughing as they bit into fruits that dripped with gold-colored juice. But soon the laughter faded. The food never diminished. Each bite was replaced, each cup refilled as though the feast existed in a state untouched by consumption. By midnight, the square was silent, the villagers staring at their plates, chewing slowly as if under instruction. At dawn, the tables were empty, but the plates remained each one marked with a single ring of wax, as though a candle had been set upon it and allowed to burn down completely. The night-all names were forgotten. It began just before midnight, when a woman called across the lane to her neighbor and stopped mid-sentence, unable to remember his name. Within minutes, the entire village felt the same weightless panic name slipping away like smoke from their tongues. Parents forgot the names of their children, lovers forgot each other's, and even the familiar syllables of their own were gone. They tried to write them down, but the letters swam on the page, reforming into symbols no one recognized. In the orchard, The trees seemed taller, their shadows bending over the village like watchful figures. Some claimed to hear whispers offering to return the names in exchange for something else, though none would say what was asked. By sunrise, the names returned, sudden and complete, but left behind a strange hollowness, as if part of the meaning had been siphoned away. No one spoke of it openly, but from that day on, certain words tasted different in the mouth as though touched by soil. The hollow noon. The term had long been part of the village's whispered lore, a midday when the light would dim the air still, and the orchard's branches would cast no shadows. This year it came in late May. At exactly 12 o'clock, the sunlight dulled to the color of river clay, and sound seemed to fold inward. Even the bell's constant hum fell silent. Those in the fields reported seeing figures standing between the rows of trees, each one holding a candle whose flame burned a pale blue. Time felt unpinned. Some swore the hour lasted only minutes, while others claimed they lived entire days within it. In the square, people froze mid-motion, suspended like figures in amber, while others moved freely, touching their still neighbors without stirring them. When the light returned, everyone carried on as if nothing had happened except for a faint line of wax on their palms, as though they had all been holding candles without realizing it. The return of the sisters. On the eve of midsummer, the river lit gold again, and this time the candle sisters rose fully from the water. They stood on its surface as easily as a floor, their gowns dripping, not with water, but with petals that dissolved upon hitting the current. They spoke aloud, now their voices layered and resonant, carrying through the entire hollow. They called no names, made no demands, only told the villagers, "It is time." Those nearest the bank saw that the sisters' eyes reflected not the night sky but the orchard in full bloom. Without instruction, the people began to walk toward the chapel, their steps in perfect unison, as if following a pattern they had known all their lives. The sisters turned and drifted toward the orchard's edge, their glow sinking into the ground until only the faint scent of beeswax remained. Inside the chapel, the candles lit themselves, their flames bending once again toward the basin at the altar, which now brimmed with that same golden water. The orchard. Inside their eye. That night, the basin's water reflected not the orchard but the face of each villager who peered in. Yet within each reflection, their eyes were not their own. In place of their irises bloomed the orchard itself, branches, blossoms, and the faint shimmer of river light. As they stared, the reflection blinked once independent of the onlooker, and the vision of the orchard within grew deeper, stretching into a vastness that seemed to have no end. One by one, the villagers reached into the water, their hands passing through as though into warm air, and when they withdrew them, their palms were damp with waxy gold. By dawn, the basin was empty, its stone warm as a heartbeat, and the orchard outside stood unchanged, yet those who had touched the water now walked with a stillness, a patience as though listening to something rooted deep within them. No one asked what they had seen. No one had to. The lanterns under the roots. 3 nights after midsummer, a group of children ventured into the orchard at dusk, chasing the flicker of fireflies. Instead, they found small glass lanterns wedged into the soil beneath the gnarled roots of the oldest trees. The lanterns glowed faintly, not with flame, but with a slow pulse like a heartbeat. Each one contained what looked like a curled seed suspended in golden wax. The children touched them, and in that instant the orchard's hum deepened into a note they felt in their chests. They ran to tell their parents, but by the time anyone else arrived, the lanterns had vanished, leaving only shallow hollows in the dirt. That night, those same children dreamed of walking through the orchard in autumn, the lanterns hanging from every branch like fruit, and the candle sisters waiting at the center, their faces lit from within. The harvest of shadows. August brought an unnatural ripening to the orchard. The fruit swelled overnight, dark-skinned and heavy, the leaves curling inward as though guarding something. When picked, the fruit was cold to the touch, and when cut open, no flesh was found, only darkness that seemed to drink in the light. Those who dared to taste it swore they heard whispers in their own voices, speaking truths they had never admitted aloud. A quiet dread spread through the village, yet the fruit continued to fall, vanishing before it hit the ground as though claimed by unseen hands. On the last day of the month, the second shadows returned, gathering beneath each tree and weaving together into a single moving shape that slipped between the rows and vanished into the chapel. Inside the basin at the altar, rippled once, then stilled. The door opens. Inward. When September came, the river door returned, only this time it stood in the center of the chapel. No hinges, no frame, just the door upright on the stone floor. Its surface bore the marks of countless hands, pressed into the grain as though many had tried to push it open. The villagers gathered, uncertain whether to flee or approach. Then, without a sound, the door swung inward, revealing not the orchard, not the river, but a darkness alive with faint points of light like stars beneath water. The candle sisters stepped through, each carrying a lantern with a golden seed inside. They placed the lanterns in the basin, and the golden water rose up to swallow them whole. The door closed again, but its outline remained scorched into the stone. The last toll. The chapel bell's silent since hollow noon rang once. The sound was unlike any before, low resonant, as though it came from beneath the ground. Every candle in the chapel flared their flames, bending toward the basin which began to overflow. The liquid did not spill onto the floor. It floated upward, forming a single sphere of gold light that hung above the altar. Within it, branches swayed in a wind that could not be felt. The villagers stood frozen, the glow painting their faces with an otherworldly sheen. Then the sphere burst silently, its light streaming into each person's eyes. For a heartbeat, every pupil bloomed with the orchard before returning to black. The bell's echo lingered long after carrying into the hills. The orchard without seasons. When the first frost came again, the orchard did not change. Its leaves stayed green, its blossoms fresh, and its fruit, if fruit it was, remained small and unfallen. Yet those who entered swore they saw seasons pass in moments, a branch, blooming fruit, swelling leaves, falling bare wood, glistening with snow, then flowering again, all in the space of a breath. The candle sisters were never seen again, but the villagers walked with the same stillness as those who had touched the golden basin month before. Outsiders who came to the hollow often left quickly, unsettled by the way the people seemed to listen to something unheard. The chapel stood empty now, its altar bare, but on certain nights, if one stood within the stone circle and closed their eyes, they would feel roots beneath their feet, deep and endless, whispering in a voice that sounded very much like their own. And so the orchard stood inside the land, inside the people, and inside the eye, without beginning or end.